When I leave Jerusalem, I feel like I can breathe again. I love Jerusalem stories. I love sharing Jerusalem stories, but I feel like when I'm in the city, I'm holding my breath. And here, I just let it out. This is the environment that I feel most alive in. But I have to tell you, life here was hard. It was really difficult, and it shaped the way people thought, and it shaped the way people believed. The Bible is a local book. Its stories and its poetry and its metaphors can't be moved to other locations and have the same impact as they do when you read them as part of this space. So let me help you get to know the Judean hill country just a little bit better. You can see that we're in the central mountains of this land, and they are big mountains. Very steep slopes, 60% of which is eroded to bedrock, and they plunge and terminate in these very, very narrow V-shaped valleys below us. The only natural farm field that exists is at the very bottom of this system. And if you're only going to farm that, you only have food from a very few acres. The only option, you have to build. Yes, you have to build your own farmland, acre by acre by acre by acre, bringing the soil from the bottom of the valley up to your terraced field, bagful by bagful, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. It takes 4 to 12 years to build just 1 acre of farmland here. That means that you build farm fields mostly for your children and grandchildren rather than for yourself. When the land takes generations to prepare for cultivation, it becomes an extremely valuable inheritance. So when we read about God's foundational promises to Abram and Sarah in the book of Genesis, a promise of ownership and prosperity, it is significant. Abraham had followed God's call, given over 50 years earlier, to leave his father's land in the east and migrate to this land. Abraham was a foreigner, an immigrant. Abraham even gives himself the title Ger. This means he is someone living off the land, someone who doesn't own land, a temporary resident. None of these imply belonging. And so, Abraham waited for God's promise to come to life. He waited and waited and waited. Abraham and Sarah were now both over 120 years old, and like those who had built the terraced fields around them, they wondered if they would ever see the result. We're in Hebron, about 18 miles south of Jerusalem, and it's about as far south as you can get in Judah's hill country. We're here to talk about one of the saddest and the most enduring of the Judean hill country stories at this location, the Machpelah, or the tomb of the Patriarchs. As readers of Scripture, we've been waiting since Genesis 12 to find Abraham in possession of the land the Lord had promised to give him. God had not kept the promise he had made to Abraham and Sarah. He had promised Abraham growth in his family. He had promised him land, and he had promised him that from that family, on that land, blessing would be restored to the nations. But the moment comes into sharp focus when the family faces a crisis. Sarah has died, and they have no personal property to use as the family tomb. Abraham grieved. The text talks about his pouring out his heart over the loss of his beloved Sarah. He drags himself to the ancient city gate of Hebron and inquires if there might be someone here who would be willing to sell him a field with a cave where he might bury her. That's where the story comes in that involves this location here, the tomb of the Patriarchs. Ephron the Hittite steps up and begins the bargaining process. He says, "Oh, what is land cost between friends? take it. The field and the cave that I own, they're yours. Abraham responds, look, I'll pay a fair price. His grief weighing him down. Ephron comes back, okay, it's worth 400 shekels, but what's that between friends? Abraham says, okay. The bargaining that we would expect him to make is simply absent, his grief holding him back. And he takes his beloved Sarah and places her here. And only at this moment, when the deal is sealed with Ephron the Hittite, do we find the family that had been promised land actually owning deeded property. And what's also interesting about this place is that Abraham and some of his promised descendants were also buried here. Abram's son Isaac and his wife Rebekah, and then Isaac's son Jacob with his wife Leah. That's actually why Herod the Great built this incredible monument here. It's a 39-foot high wall that surrounds the field and the cave. It's because people throughout the Old Testament era and into the New Testament era and to this very moment come here to remember the vital relationship between this place and the promises that God made to Abram in Genesis 12. The promise of God not only started here. Through Sarah's death, it took root here. It wasn't until Sarah was buried in the ground that the promise began to be fulfilled. The promise of blessing, of light, of truth, not just for Abraham and his family, but for the whole world. But just like the labor-intensive, slow and persistent construction of the Judean hill country cultivated land, the promise would only fully blossom for a future generation.